It's 1953. Deep inside a hidden government laboratory, a man sits in a metal chair. His wrists are bound. His pupils dart wildly under the sterile glare of the overhead light. He doesn't know why he's here. He doesn't know what's coming. All he knows is that something feels wrong. He takes a sip of coffee, his third that morning, trying to calm his nerve. But this cup isn't like the others. It's laced. Inside, the bitter taste hides a substance that will tear open his perception of reality. Within minutes, his laughter echoes down the hall. Then come the screams. The kind of screams that don't sound human anymore. Behind a two-way mirror, men in dark suits scribble notes. Their faces expressionless. Their pens scratching furiously as the subject breaks. In the early 1950s, American scientists were paid to break the human mind. Their mission? To erase free will itself. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a Cold War thriller. This was real. Authorized. Funded. Executed by the Central Intelligence Agency. This is the story the CIA fought to erase. The dark history of their secret experiments on the human mind. The year is 1945. The world has just survived the most devastating war in human history. Cities lie in ruins, nations are rebuilding, and yet, amid the ashes of victory, a new kind of fear begins to take hold. The war may have ended, but the real battle has only just begun. The battle for the human mind. As the Cold War dawned, paranoia spread like wildfire through Washington. Whispers of Soviet brainwashing, psychological conditioning, and secret communist experiments sent chills through the corridors of power. American prisoners of war returning from Korea spoke of strange interrogations, of being reprogrammed, made to confess to crimes they never committed. The idea that an enemy could seize control of thought itself terrified U.S. intelligence. Inside the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, that fear turned into obsession. If the Soviets or Chinese had discovered a way to control human behavior, then America had to go further. Faster. Deeper. The nation that had unleashed the atomic bomb now wanted to master something even more dangerous, the human psyche. And so, in the early 1950s, under the quiet authority of Director Allen Dulles, the CIA launched a top-secret program known as Project MKUltra. Its goal was simple, but horrifying, to find a way to control people's minds. The methods, however, would go far beyond anything the world had ever imagined. Scientists, psychologists, chemists, some recruited from Nazi Germany under Operation Paperclip, were tasked with designing experiments that blurred the boundaries between science and torture. They were told to explore every possibility. Hypnosis, hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and psychological conditioning. Anything that could break a person's will, rewrite their identity, or erase their memory entirely was fair game. Publicly, the CIA claimed it was defending democracy. Behind closed doors, morality was discarded in the name of national security. Documents were labeled eyes only. Subjects were often unwitting. Consent was optional, if it existed at all. America's greatest institutions of knowledge, universities, hospitals, and research labs, quietly became the stage for these covert experiments. Grants were funneled through front organizations. Professors thought they were studying the effects of stress or learning. In reality, they were participating in a secret psychological war against humanity itself. The line between defense and madness vanished. What began as a mission to protect freedom soon became an obsession with control. Power, after all, is addictive, and no power is greater than the ability to command the human mind. By the mid-1950s, MKUltra had grown into a labyrinth of subprojects. Hundreds of scientists, millions of dollars, and countless human subjects, some prisoners, some mental patients, others completely innocent, were all sacrificed for a single goal: to create a method of absolute obedience. The United States, the beacon of liberty, had begun experimenting with the destruction of free will. All under the banner of security. All in secret. But to understand just how far they went, we need to go inside the minds and the labs of the men who led it. His name was Sidney Gottlieb, a quiet, unassuming man who could have passed for any small-town science teacher. But behind the thick glasses and mild demeanor hid one of the most dangerous minds of the Cold War. To his colleagues, he was known simply as the chemist. To those who later uncovered his legacy, he would be called something else: the CIA's poisoner-in-chief. Born to immigrant parents in the Bronx, Gottlieb had grown up as the picture of the American dream. Brilliant, disciplined, endlessly curious, he earned a Ph.D. in chemistry and became fascinated by how the mind could be influenced through chemicals. When the CIA came knocking in the early 1950s, Gottlieb saw not just a job, but a calling. America was locked in a psychological war with the Soviet Union, and the battlefield wasn't fought with bombs or tanks. It was fought inside the human brain. Gottlieb believed that chemistry could unlock the deepest secrets of consciousness, that the mind could be taken apart and rebuilt like a machine. He envisioned a drug that could make a man reveal any secret or forget it entirely. A chemical that could control behavior, erase memory, and even destroy the very sense of self. In his eyes, the mind was no longer sacred. It was clay to be molded, and the tool he would use to shape it was a strange new substance discovered in Switzerland, LSD. In 1953, the CIA purchased the world's entire supply of LSD from a Swiss pharmaceutical company. Under Gottlieb's direction, it was distributed to military bases, prisons, hospitals, and universities across America. No one outside the agency knew what was happening. Scientists were told only that they were conducting behavioral research. In reality, they were exploring how to control human thought. The first experiments were crude and cruel. CIA officers were secretly dosed with LSD without warning, just to observe their reactions. Some laughed. Some panicked. One man reportedly ran screaming through Washington, convinced his body was melting. Gottlieb watched all of it with clinical fascination. To him, this was data, evidence, progress. He believed LSD could be the ultimate truth serum, capable of shattering a person's mental defenses. But the tests quickly spiraled into chaos. Agents began dosing each other for fun, sometimes during meetings or parties. There were no rules, no oversight, and certainly no consent. The drug's unpredictable power fascinated Gottlieb even more. He wanted to understand its full potential, no matter the cost. That cost would soon come in the form of a man named Frank Olson. Olson was a biochemist who worked alongside Gottlieb at Fort Detrick, Maryland, a secretive lab that specialized in biological warfare. By all accounts, Olson was loyal, brilliant, and deeply patriotic. But in November of 1953, Gottlieb decided to use him as an unwitting test subject. During a retreat with CIA colleagues, Olson was slipped a drink laced with LSD. Within hours, he began to unravel. He became paranoid, agitated, and increasingly disturbed by the work he was doing. Over the next few days, Olson's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He spoke of wanting to resign. He told his wife something terrible had happened. And then, 9 days later, he was dead. The official story said he had leapt from the window of a New York hotel room in the middle of the night. The death was ruled a suicide. But the details didn't add up. The glass was shattered outward. There were bruises on Olson's body inconsistent with a fall. And the CIA immediately moved to cover it up. For years, the Olson family was told it was an accident, a nervous breakdown. It wasn't until 2 decades later, when MKUltra was publicly exposed, that they learned the truth. Frank Olson had been drugged without his knowledge by his own government. His death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the first known casualty of Project MKUltra. The Olson family fought for decades to uncover what really happened. In 1975, after the story broke during the Church Committee hearings, President Gerald Ford personally apologized to them. But the apology came too late, and the truth was still incomplete. In the 1990s, Frank Olson's body was exhumed by forensic experts. They discovered evidence of blunt force trauma to his head, suggesting he may have been struck before falling or being thrown from the window. Murder disguised as suicide. To this day, the full details remain hidden beneath redacted files and classified documents. But one thing is certain: Frank Olson's death marked the beginning of a pattern, a trail of secrecy, denial, and human ruin. And at the center of it all was Sidney Gottlieb, a man who saw morality as a luxury, science as a weapon, and human beings as test subjects in his grand experiment. He operated in the shadows, funded by the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth, answering to no one but his own ambition. But LSD was just the beginning. The CIA wanted to reprogram human beings completely. They called it research. But what took place in the following years would defy every boundary of ethics, medicine, and human decency. After the mysterious death of Frank Olson, Sidney Gottlieb pushed MKUltra into a new phase, one that moved beyond government laboratories and into the real world. Hospitals, prisons, and mental asylums became silent battlegrounds for the mind. Patients thought they were being treated. Inmates believed they were being rehabilitated. But behind locked doors, the truth was much darker. LSD became the CIA's favorite tool, a key to unlock the subconscious. In hospitals across the country, doctors, secretly funded by the agency, began dosing patients without their consent. Some were told they were taking new medication for anxiety. Others weren't told anything at all. They woke up to find their minds fractured, hallucinations tearing through reality. At a hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, drug addicts seeking treatment were offered early release or extra doses of their drug of choice in exchange for participating in experiments. Many agreed, without realizing they were volunteering to be subjects in a psychological war. They were injected with LSD for weeks, sometimes months. When the tests ended, many could barely remember who they were. In prisons, the story was no less horrifying. Inmates were used like lab rats, dosed, deprived of sleep, isolated for days under blinding lights or complete darkness. Guards watched through peepholes as minds unraveled in slow motion. The CIA wanted to see how far a person could be pushed before breaking, and how easily that broken mind could be reshaped. And then there were the soldiers. Men who had sworn to serve their country were secretly dosed during training exercises, briefings, and medical exams. Some were sent into combat in altered states, confused and terrified. Their reports were buried, their trauma dismissed. The military called it field research. But the most disturbing experiments didn't take place in hospitals or prisons. They happened in safe houses, ordinary apartments in San Francisco and New York. On paper, they were CIA observation facilities. In reality, they were the stage for one of the most depraved subprojects in MKUltra's history. The operation was called Midnight Climax. To the unsuspecting public, these were just ordinary city buildings. But inside, the walls hid one-way mirrors, cameras, and recording devices. Prostitutes, hired by the CIA, were instructed to lure men, businessmen, government workers, tourists, back to the safe houses. The men were then given drinks secretly laced with LSD. As the drugs took hold, agents behind the glass observed everything, recording their reactions, conversations, and vulnerabilities. The goal? To study how drugs and sex could be used as tools of manipulation and interrogation. But in practice, it became a twisted playground for voyeurism and abuse. CIA operatives watched through the glass as human beings were reduced to experiment. No consent, no accountability, just curiosity and control. One of the men overseeing these operations, George Hunter White, was a former narcotics agent who bragged in his reports about the fun of it all. He decorated the rooms with suggestive posters, stocked them with alcohol, and called them pads. His notes read less like scientific observations and more like the diary of a man who'd lost his soul. Meanwhile, the American public had no idea. In an age defined by Cold War paranoia, the government justified everything as a matter of national security. The fear of communism had become so pervasive that almost any act, no matter how immoral, could be excused if it was said to protect freedom. The CIA's rationale was simple: if we don't do it first, the Soviets will. And so the experiments continued. Hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and code names, MKUltra expanded into more than 150 subprojects, each one probing a different way to control the mind. Hypnosis, isolation, sensory deprivation, electroshock, even attempts to induce amnesia. Doctors and scientists, some knowingly, others unwittingly, participated in what became one of the largest human experimentation programs in modern history. The victims, however, were rarely given a choice. Many were the marginalized, the poor, the imprisoned, the mentally ill, or the addicted. They were easy to manipulate, easy to dismiss, and, most importantly, easy to forget. To the CIA, they were numbers, data points, expendable lives in the pursuit of psychological dominance. And yet, the men behind these experiments believed they were patriot. They told themselves they were defending democracy from a ruthless enemy, that their sacrifices, other people's suffering, would one day save lives. But where is the line between protection and monstrosity? When does defense become destruction? For some, like Gottlieb, that line no longer existed. His quest for control had consumed him, and the agency around him. MKUltra had become a machine that fed on secrecy and fear, and it showed no signs of slowing down. But soon, the limits of LSD and hypnosis would begin to reveal themselves. The experiments weren't producing the results the CIA hoped for. The mind wasn't as easily programmable as they had imagined. Instead of control, there was chaos. Instead of obedience, madness. And when the experiments began to fail, the CIA didn't stop. They went darker. If MKUltra had already crossed every imaginable line, what came next would shatter even the illusion of morality that remained. When chemicals and LSD failed to deliver total mind control, the CIA decided to take a new approach. One not just to alter the mind, but to erase it. Their search led them north, across the border, to a respected psychiatrist in Montreal, Canada, Dr. Donald Ewen Cameron. To the public, he was a pioneer in mental health, the president of both the American and World Psychiatric Associations. But to the CIA, he was something far more valuable, a man unburdened by doubt, willing to test the limits of human identity itself. Cameron believed that mental illness could be cured by breaking down a patient's mind and rebuilding it from scratch. He called the process psychic driving. The CIA called it a potential weapon. Funded secretly through front organizations tied to MKUltra, Cameron began his gruesome experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. His patients, many of them women suffering from depression, postpartum anxiety, or even mild psychological distress, believed they were receiving cutting-edge therapy. Instead, they were stepping into a nightmare. Cameron's methods were brutal. Patients were subjected to repeated electroshock treatments, not the standard medical dosage, but dozens of times stronger. Their memories were burned away, synapses fried until they forgot not just their traumas, but their names, their families, and their entire lives. Afterward, he would play endless loops of recorded messages, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, while patients were kept in drug-induced comas. His goal was to reprogram their thoughts, replacing old memories with new command. Imagine lying in a hospital bed, sedated, unable to move, your mind emptied by electricity, and a voice repeating over and over, "You are a good mother. You will obey. You will forget." Imagine waking up not knowing who you are, because your government wanted to see if they could rebuild you. Many of Cameron's patients emerged from treatment as shadows of their former selves. They couldn't recognize their families. Some regressed to childlike states, unable to feed or dress themselves. Others lived the rest of their lives in psychiatric wards, their identities forever erased. One woman, known publicly as Linda MacDonald, entered the Allen Memorial Institute in 1963 for mild postpartum depression. After weeks of Cameron's therapy, she lost every memory of her adult life. Her husband had to reteach her how to walk, talk, and read. It was as if her mind had been rebooted, her personality erased. She wasn't alone. Decades later, survivors began to come forward, piecing together the fragments of what had been done to them. They spoke of endless darkness, of voices in the walls, of the terror of waking up to find their own thoughts replaced by another's. But in the 1950s and 60s, no one questioned Cameron. His reputation shielded him. The hospital's affiliation with McGill University lent him legitimacy. And the CIA's funding was buried under layers of fake organizations and Shell grant. Even the Canadian government had no idea its citizens were being used in a foreign agency's psychological warfare experiment. Cameron's work fascinated Gottlieb and his team in Langley. To them, he was proving what they had only theorized, that the mind could be stripped clean, its contents erased like chalk from a blackboard. If it could be wiped, perhaps it could be rewritten. Perhaps obedience could be programmed. But the results were unstable. For every patient whose mind was destroyed, none were truly rebuilt. The experiments produced broken people, not controlled ones. Still, the CIA kept the funding flowing. The logic was horrifyingly simple. Failure was still data. And because everything was classified, the victims had no recourse. They couldn't sue. They couldn't even prove what had happened. The medical records were falsified. The funding trails hidden. Doctors denied involvement. The CIA's fingerprints were nowhere to be found. The secrecy allowed unchecked abuse. Every failure, every tragedy, every lost life was swallowed by bureaucracy. What mattered was not humanity, but results. Over time, Cameron's ambitions grew darker. He began experimenting with sensory deprivation, isolating patients in pitch-black rooms for weeks, believing the absence of stimuli would make the mind malleable. Others were subjected to drug cocktails, barbiturates, amphetamines, hallucinogens, all designed to break down mental resistance. It wasn't science anymore. It was cruelty disguised as curiosity. Years later, when the truth began to surface, Cameron's victims would fight for justice. Some won small settlements. Others received nothing. Their lives had been stolen in the name of progress, and no apology could bring them back. The CIA's involvement remained shrouded in secrecy, but the evidence was undeniable. The agency had crossed international borders to destroy lives in pursuit of control. They had funded a man who erased human beings, and they called it research. By the mid-1960s, MKUltra had spent millions. But the truth began to leak, and what followed would expose the darkest corner of American intelligence. By the early 1970s, the walls of secrecy surrounding MKUltra were beginning to crack. The Vietnam War had fractured America's trust in its leaders, and whispers of government overreach were spreading through the press. Inside CIA headquarters, panic began to grow. Project MKUltra had stretched for 2 decades, through presidents, wars, and generations of agents. The experiments had crossed ethical, legal, and moral boundaries that could never withstand the light of day. So, in 1973, with scandal brewing and investigations into CIA misconduct on the horizon, Director Richard Helms made a fateful decision. He ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Tons of documents, detailed records of experiments, human subjects, payments, and results were fed into shredders and furnaces. Decades of secrets reduced to ash. It was a systematic erasure of history, an attempt to wipe away one of the darkest chapters in American intelligence before anyone could uncover it. But Helms made one mistake. A few boxes of financial documents and sub-project reports survived, stored in an overlooked archive that escaped the purge. Years later, these fragments would resurface, igniting one of the most shocking revelations in U.S. history. In 1975, amid the post-Watergate reckoning, the U.S. Senate launched an investigation into abuses by the intelligence community. It was called the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church, and its mission was to expose the crimes committed in the name of national security. As the hearings unfolded, the American public watched in disbelief. Declassified documents revealed that their own government had drugged, hypnotized, and tortured citizens without their knowledge or consent. Ordinary people, soldiers, prisoners, and patients had all been test subjects in a covert psychological war. Newspapers across the country ran the story. CIA conducted mind control experiments. The details were grotesque. LSD testing on civilians, secret brothels in San Francisco, brainwashing research in mental hospitals. Each revelation peeled back another layer of deceit, painting a picture of a government that had lost its moral compass. When the Church Committee questioned former CIA officials, they dodged, denied, or pleaded ignorance. "We were fighting communism," they said. It was a different time. But those excuses rang hollow. America's enemies had not done this to them. They had done it to themselves. For the first time, the public glimpsed how far fear and paranoia could push a democracy. Under the banner of freedom, the U.S. government had sanctioned cruelty and erased lives. And when the truth began to surface, it tried to erase the evidence, too. But even in exposure, there was no real justice. Victims came forward, families of those drugged, the survivors of Cameron's experiments in Canada, and former soldiers who still lived with psychological scars. They sued the CIA, demanding accountability. Most of those cases were quietly dismissed. Government lawyers invoked the sacred phrase, national security. It became the ultimate shield, a phrase that silenced the victims and sealed the truth back into classified vault. The courts ruled that exposing further details would endanger the nation. So once again, secrecy prevailed over justice. Some victims received token settlements, small checks that could never compensate for the decades of torment. Others received nothing. Many died still waiting for answers. The government's apology, when it came, was vague and detached, a bureaucratic formality. Behind the scenes, the intelligence community quietly restructured, rebranding and renaming programs. MKUltra officially ended, but its mindset endured. That human psychology could be weaponized, that secrecy justified all things, and that national defense outweighed morality. The most haunting question remained: what happens when a government loses its moral compass in the name of safety? When fear becomes the justification for everything, who decides what's right? The CIA claimed it was protecting democracy from totalitarianism, yet in doing so, it mirrored the very authoritarian cruelty it sought to defeat. The legacy of MKUltra didn't die with its files. Its philosophy, control through knowledge, obedience through manipulation, evolved with technology. As the decades passed, the tools changed, but the goal remained eerily familiar. Instead of LSD, there were algorithms. Instead of hypnosis, there was data profiling. Instead of secret experiments in hidden rooms, there was psychological influence conducted through screens and feed. Modern warfare had moved online, an invisible battlefield for the mind. Governments and corporations alike learned to steer attention, emotions, and beliefs with precision. The new psychological operations didn't need drugs. They needed information. They didn't erase memories. They rewrote them in real time through endless scrolls of digital suggestion. The parallels are impossible to ignore. The same obsession with control that drove MKUltra still echoes through modern systems of surveillance, propaganda, and behavioral science. It may wear a different face, but its intent is hauntingly familiar: to understand the human mind not for healing, but for power. By the mid-1970s, MKUltra was officially dead. But its spirit lingered in the shadows of every secret program that came after it. The world had learned the name, but not the full truth. And even after MKUltra ended, the question remains: did it ever truly stop? Even after MKUltra was officially terminated, the pursuit of mind control didn't simply vanish. It changed its name, its form, and its method. Within the walls of Langley, the CIA quietly shifted funding into successor programs. MK Search, MK Naomi, and a dozen other classified behavioral studies that picked up where Gottlieb's work left off. The goal was no longer to control the human mind through drugs, but to influence it through environment, suggestion, and fear. By the 1980s, new psychological operations had emerged, methods of interrogation, manipulation, and behavioral conditioning that echoed the same logic as MKUltra. Only now they were refined, clinical, and stripped of the visible chaos that had once exposed them. The agency had learned its lesson. Control was most effective when invisible. When the war on terror began decades later, echoes of MKUltra's philosophy reappeared. Inside Guantanamo Bay and other black sites, reports surfaced of enhanced interrogation techniques, sensory deprivation, stress positions, sleep manipulation, and psychological torture. The same foundations laid by Gottlieb's team were being reborn under a new justification, not to destroy communism this time, but to fight terrorism. Different enemy, same methods, and beyond the battlefield, control had taken an even subtler form. Governments and corporations now held vast oceans of data, mapping not only what people did, but how they thought, what they feared, and what they desired. Instead of LSD, the new weapon was information. Social influence operations, once crude propaganda, evolved into digital systems that could nudge behavior, alter perception, and quietly rewrite collective memory. MKUltra's ghost was alive, not in laboratories, but in algorithms. The experiment had simply gone global. They had failed to control the human mind, but they had learned how to shape belief, memory, and perception. And in the end, that turned out to be far more powerful. The story of MKUltra is more than a dark footnote in history. It's a warning. A reminder of what happens when fear outweighs morality, when progress becomes an excuse for cruelty, and when those in power decide that human beings are tools to be used, rather than lives to be protected. Behind every classified document and shredded file were real people. Men, women, and even children who never consented to be part of an experiment. Patients who trusted their doctors. Soldiers who trusted their superiors. Citizens who trusted their government. Their minds were invaded, their identities erased, all in the name of an ideology that promised safety at any cost. Today, technology has given us power those scientists could only dream of. We can track thoughts through patterns, predict behavior through data, and influence entire populations with a single headline or algorithm. But with every advance comes the same question that haunted the 1950s. How far is too far? If our governments once believed controlling the human mind was possible, who's to say they've stopped trying? As the music fades and the black and white footage of old laboratories flickers across the screen, one question lingers, the one you can't shake, no matter how you try. What would you do if your own government experimented on you, and called it national security?